Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be talking about a state that will be very important come 2026, and it's none other than the state of North Carolina. This is not a surprise. North Carolina's been a competitive state for over a decade now. Republicans have had more success here federally. Democrats made a lot of inroads down ballot, but the fact remains that the Democrats have yet to win a federal election here at the statewide level since 2008. And that's where I want to begin this video. I want to talk about the fact that North Carolina has actually been a pretty big disappointment for the Democratic Party since what was a very promising 2008 election. And so to really think about this, we have to contextualize. So in the 2000s, North Carolina was and this is just going to be a very brief history before I talk about 2026, but I think it's important. In the 2000s, North Carolina was a very red state. It wasn't as red, to give a comparison, it wasn't as red as, say, Alabama or Louisiana or, like, Arkansas. But it was a, low to mid-teens Republican state. Your kind of trends aside, in terms of margin, it was kind of similar to a state like maybe Iowa or Ohio, maybe a bit bluer than South Carolina is nowadays. But it was a likely to safe Republican state. And even in 2004, when the Democratic nominee for vice president, John Edwards, was from North Carolina, it was a 13-point victory for the Republican George W. Bush. And then in 2008, what we saw was North Carolina had a ton of shift, especially in the cities and in the suburbs, and it voted for Barack Obama very narrowly by, I think, only, it was less than 1%. Concurrently, though, what we saw was that in 2008, the Democratic candidate for Senate, Kay Hagan, also won. So North Carolina, Democrats had some success in Senate elections there in the 2000s, but they won a pretty big victory in 2008 with Obama and winning the Senate race. And they thought, hey, look, these trends we're getting in the suburbs, we're getting in the cities, they're going to carry us to make North Carolina a blue-leaning state for the foreseeable future. Then in 2012, Barack Obama lost North Carolina. It was only by about 3 or 4%, so it wasn't that bad. But things would get worse from there. Kay Hagan lost re-election in 2014. Democrats lost North Carolina in 2016 to Donald Trump. Then in 2020, despite a lot of polling having Joe Biden ahead there, Biden lost it by around 1.5 points. And then in 2020, Democrats were widely favored to win a Senate race there, and they fell short to the surprise of many. And so in 2024, Democrats had an okay year here. If you watched my channel last year, I never had Donald Trump behind North Carolina. I consistently showed him winning it by around 2%. In my final forecast, as you can see, he won it by a little over 3%. But Democrats did have a little bit of success down the ballot, and that's what I want to talk about to get into 2026, because they won the governorship by 15, which was a huge win for them. They also, what you'll notice is that there are some kind of, row offices, as we call them, where Democrats did quite well. They won the lieutenant governor race. They won the race for attorney general. They lost some of these lower races, but they did hold on to the Secretary of State position, and they actually won what was a relatively consequential superintendent of public instruction race. This was kind of an education proxy war that the Democrats came out on top on. I know Democrats were hoping to win the treasurer election. Is the only one that I think kind of went wrong for them here. But beyond that, and they also won a 100-vote victory in the Supreme Court election. So, this was a very, 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 mixed result, I would say, in 2024. But the fact of the matter is the biggest race here was by far the presidential race, and Trump won it. And so Democrats, they still haven't won a statewide federal race in 17 years in North Carolina. It's been nearly 17 years since that happened. And so let's talk about it. Let's talk about 2026. Let's talk about that federal election. So in 2026, we are going to have a Senate election in North Carolina. This is the same seat that Republicans claimed in 2020, despite the fact that they were behind in the polling. And Democrats, I think, on paper, have a good chance at this seat. Now, to talk a little bit about the environment, because I think you have to start any conversation you have about any federal or even local, but more federal election in an off year, you have to talk about the environment first. And 2026 will be a midterm with a Republican in office. And generally speaking, the law of American politics is that the party in power does not do nearly as well in the midterms. There are a couple exceptions to that rule, but it generally holds true. Now, in 2022, Democrats actually had a pretty solid year. It was by no means a blue wave, but they held their own to a pretty large extent, and they did better than most people expected in 2022. But that they were aided in part by pretty poor candidate selection from the Republicans across the board, as well as the fact that the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, was broadly unpopular with the American electorate. And so overall, even though Democrats were rightfully happy with how they did across the board for the most part in 2022, that wasn't a blue wave, and it was probably not a blue wave because Biden was in office and he wasn't popular. Now, at this point, Donald Trump is not nearly as unpopular as Joe Biden was by 2022, but we're only 5 months into his term. Biden, at this point in 2021, in June of 2021, was still above water in terms of approval rating, and Donald Trump, is still worse than Biden was at this point. Now, I'm not saying Trump's going to fall to Biden levels of unpopularity. I think that Trump's base is firmer than Biden's was in that regard. But I do think that Trump is unlikely to be, a popular president, really at any point, just given how polarizing a figure he's been and given how his first term, in terms of his approval ratings, went. Donald Trump was never particularly popular during his first term either. And so that creates what I would expect to be a relatively Democratic-leaning environment. And the last time Donald Trump was in office, we had a midterm. Democrats won the national popular vote by 8.5%. And that was a lot of people don't forget this, but that was a decisive Democratic victory in terms of on a national scale. And so I don't think that's going to happen again. I think it might happen if Democrats get really lucky, but I think we're more looking at a more 2020 type environment where the Democratic Party maybe wins by 4 or 5% nationally. That's just my rough estimate. They might win by a little less, they might win by a little more, but it's going to be around a 4, maybe 4.5 point margin if you had to make a specific prediction. And so North Carolina in 2024 rather, as you can see, voted for Donald Trump by 3.2%, and he won the national popular vote by 1.5%. So, unless my mental math is incorrect, the state of North Carolina was roughly 1.7% to the right of the country. So if you translate that exactly, you say North Carolina is 1.7% to the right of the country, and Democrats being conservative here win by 4, they'd be ahead of North Carolina by around 2.3%. So if everything else is equal, Democrats win the North Carolina Senate race by a little over 2. So that would be good for them, right? Like, Democrats would like to win North Carolina. They haven't done it in 17 years federally. Statewide, of course, I have to make that clear. But what's interesting is that the Democrats have a number of good candidates to run here, and they haven't necessarily, gotten on that just yet. And the guy they want to run is Roy Cooper. Now, Roy Cooper was the former governor of North Carolina. He was the governor from 2017 to 2025. Quite popular, did pretty well in terms of his approval ratings throughout his tenure as governor. He also was, I think, the Attorney General of North Carolina before, so he's held statewide office for like 20 years. He's a little old, which I think could be, harming him, but he's not so old. He isn't nearly as old as Biden or Trump. And so Democrats want to run him. And a part of, I believe, and there's some reporting that kind of confirms this, part of the reason that Kamala Harris didn't choose him to be her VP nominee, despite the fact that the two had a great relationship, was because she was like, you should run for Senate no matter what happens in 2024. You should run for Senate in North Carolina in 2026. And so overall, I think Democrats are kind of banking on that. And so for this video, I'm going to assume that Cooper runs because I think he's more likely than not to run. He's expressed interest, but Democrats are getting a little nervous. He hasn't announced yet, and I think that, generally speaking, I think you kind of do want to announce at around this stage, around the summer. I think if he doesn't announce by the fall, by September, October, it could be a problem. But let's just focus on North Carolina now. So if it is a Cooper for the if Cooper's the Democratic nominee, and Tom Tillis, who's the incumbent Republican senator, is the Republican nominee, we're looking at a pretty competitive race. Tillis won in 2014 and 2020 in competitive environments. He had to beat an incumbent in 2014, and he had to win in a blue year in 2020. So he never has great approval ratings. He never, I think, is praised as being a particularly good candidate on paper, but he's gotten it done twice before. And in 2020, a lot of people thought he was going to lose and thought it wouldn't be that close, and he ended up pulling it out. So I would say, to start out, doubt Tom Tillis at your own will, but I think we have to look at this map now. We have to look at what happened in 2024. And Kamala Harris, this wasn't a bad performance. She lost by around 180,000 votes, roughly, somewhere near that, which is roughly 3.2%. So she lost by a bit more than Biden did. She lost by around 1.5 points more than Biden in 2020. But if you actually adjust how the country voted versus how North Carolina voted, it actually got bluer. So in 2020, Biden lost it by 1.5 points, and he won the national popular vote by 4.5. So North Carolina was just under 6% to the right of the country. So 2020, 6% rather than the country as a whole. 2024, like I said, it was only about 1.5 points, or I think 1.7, right, is what we said, to the right of the country. So it got around 4% bluer relative to the country. Now, that's a little misleading because, generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of, like, just comparing how states vote to the country, because generally when the country trends, like, say the country trends red like it did in 2024, that means a lot of states technically trended blue even though they really didn't. But it kind of shows how North Carolina is, like, well within the range of Democrats, even if they win the popular vote by only 3 or 4%. So, just kind of looking at this map here, Kamala Harris, as you might, I don't need to tell you, did well in won the urban areas, lost the rural areas. But her big problem was that she did not do well enough in two parts of the state. And it's actually, they're very different. The first is that, and this is, I think, the bigger problem Democrats have, which is that in the northern part of this state, in the more rural area up north here, Democrats have done well historically because they've had strength with black voters. But this area is actually very old, it's very rural, and it's actually trending right and losing population. So there's a community of, I don't community because it makes it sound small, it's really around like 800,000, 900,000 people that's, I think, plurality or majority black. This area has its own congressional district as a result of that because of the Voting Rights Act. But this, I think really we need to know is that this area has a sizable black population, and black voters have come out for Democrats for decades. And in 2024, that, showed a little bit of reversion. And that was a pretty big problem because the Democratic Party has relied on these voters to win elections here, right? Even though this isn't, like, necessarily as big as, like, the Charlotte metro area, in a state like North Carolina where you need to, make up only a couple 100,000 votes, it's definitely doable here. And Kamala Harris lost a couple counties here for the first time. And if we actually compare the trend from 2020, we can actually kind of see that the areas out here, swung to the right by a pretty sizable amount. You compare it to some of these areas in here, it's actually trended blue or didn't really move at all. It was quite, substantial over in this region. So that's the big problem Democrats have, is that this area is losing population, and they have been able to, and the Democratic Party hasn't been able to fix that. And I don't think they can fix it because you can't just like reverse an 8-10 year trend with just a snap of a finger. What you have to do is you have to find a way to either make inroads with other voters, or you have to, kind of counter the population dynamics reversing over time. And, there's nothing you can do to make that second thing happen. So instead, what Democrats need to do, and what Roy Cooper needs to do to win in 2026, is to focus on the research triangle, which is generally, considered kind of this area here where you have Charlotte at the bottom, you have Greensboro to the west, and you have Raleigh to the east. And you also have Durham up here, which is obviously deeply Democratic. And so Democrats have had a lot of success in Raleigh for the past really decade and a half, since 2008, where this Wake County used to be pretty Republican leaning. I think George W. Bush might have carried it, or it was very close. And Democrats now win it, as you can see, by pretty sizable margins. Now, if we compare it to how it voted in 2020, what you'll notice is that, let's see if I can find it here. Am I going to have to cheat and pull up the other map? Let's see. Well, Alexander's right there. Ooh, yeah, I'm not sure if I can find it. So we're going to have to pull up the map here. Wake County's right there. Let's see. Yeah, so it moved a bit of point to the right, but the country as a whole moved 6% to the right, so not all bad for Kamala Harris. It's pretty negligible. But what Cooper's going to have to do is he's going to have to push this, right? Kamala Harris did okay here in 2024. She didn't, do super well, but all things considered, losing 1% from Biden last time isn't terrible. It kind of shows the area is going to hold firm for Democrats. Cooper's going to have to get this to 65 if he's going to win. And I know that might sound ambitious because you're counting on an 8-point, maybe 7 or 8 point swing to get there, but Democrats have had a problem in this part of North Carolina, so to make that up, you're going to have to make up ground here, and it's quite easy to do. It's growing. You have a lot of young professionals with college degrees moving in. It's also a pretty socially liberal area, right? Democrats have gotten penalized by voters in the past, I think, 2 elections, really, because they've been seen as being too socially liberal for the country. This is not an area where you're going to have that problem. You might have that problem in rural America. You might have that problem with working class voters who don't have college degrees. These are younger professionals who are likely to be open to the perception of the Democratic Party as being socially progressive or culturally liberal. So that's the first thing you have to do. But I also want to talk about Greensboro and Durham, which are bluer. These are bluer cities. They're not super big, but they do net sizable amounts of votes. Kamala Harris in Durham won by over 100,000. That's nothing to sneeze at. And if you go back to 2020, what you'll notice, and this is, I think, the bigger problem, which is that the Democratic Party, here, let's see, I have to cheat again, Durham's right there, which is that the Democratic Party actually held up quite well relative to 2020 here. And so that means that, like in Raleigh, even though these areas are actually a lot bluer, like Durham and Orange are like 80% Democratic essentially, Guilford not as much, but focusing on Durham right here, Democrats, this is a college town. I believe this is where Duke University is, and Democrats have done really well here with voters. So percentage-wise, they did fine, but what matters is turnout. And I believe that turnout in Durham was actually not that great for Harris, even though it really should have been. And so in 2026, turnout's going to fall for everybody. Objectively, fewer people vote in midterm elections than presidential elections. It makes me very sad because midterm elections are super important, but not everyone unfortunately recognizes that. Not everyone, a lot of people vote in presidential years because they think that matters, but they don't care about midterm elections. And so both parties are going to get fewer votes, right? We know that. That all happens literally all the time. What matters, though, is getting your voters to drop by, less. So if the Republican turnout drops by 35%, Democratic turnout drops by 30%, that's a win for Democrats. And so in an area you can kind of make that up in an area like Durham where, if you have a good operation with college students, if you have a good ability to, create enthusiasm there, that's going to help you a little bit because Republican turnout's obviously going to fall, especially given that it's going to be a Trump midterm. And so we're going to wrap this up in Charlotte, which is in Mecklenburg County. And Mecklenburg County is huge. It's a little smaller than I believe Wake, but it's I think the second biggest in the state. You have well over 100 or 500,000 votes being cast, and Kamala Harris did well enough here. She got 66% of the vote. Essentially, I think it's pretty solid compared to how Biden did. Let's see if I can. We're going to take a look here. Mecklenburg voted. It's right there. Yeah, actually not too great. She lost about 2.3%. She did a little better in the suburbs, which I'll touch on for a brief period of time here. But 66% for a Democrat in Mecklenburg is not anything to sneeze at. I think Cooper could try to get it up. 70 is hard to hit, but I think getting to 68 or 69 I think is helpful. But where there's a lot of room to grow finally is right here. This is, I think, one of the most important areas to look at North Carolina. Cabarrus County, right outside Mecklenburg. It's a lot smaller, as you can see. Only around 120,000 votes roughly cast there in 2024. So it's a little smaller, but this is the example of an area where you're going to make up ground, right? Donald Trump won it by 8, and that's actually outright worse than what he did in 2020. He actually won it by, I think, nearly 10 in 2020. So he got 2% bluer for Harris, despite the fact the country as a whole shifted to the right. So clearly there's some favorable trends there for Democrats. I think Cooper should, come close to winning this if he's winning the race, right? This should be a 2 or 3 point victory for Republicans, if not a victory for Roy Cooper outright. So, again, it's growing. You have a lot of people moving in. You have a lot of, just investment in this area in general because North Carolina is a growing state. And that's a lot of people who are going to be, having college degrees who are going to be, open to voting for the Democratic Party at the very least. So in 2026, with an unpopular Trump, with a Republican Party that's, won, when I say won, I mean the popular vote. The past 2 elections, they've won the popular vote, in the House elections in 2022 and 2024. And I think the Democrats, at some point you have to get the pendulum swing back to you, and that starts in areas that are already trending your way. So I think overall, I didn't want to make a prediction for this race, and I didn't want to get into the paths for each candidate, but I think that it's important to note that for Democrats to make up this ground that I've highlighted, they have to do a couple of things, and I think most of that's going to happen in Raleigh, in Durham, in Greensboro, in Charlotte, and in the areas surrounding it. So again, this is going to be a very competitive race. It's going to be, I think, Tillis-Cooper is going to be a toss-up if Cooper runs. Tillis might be the narrow favorite if another Democrat runs instead of Cooper, but it'll be interesting for sure. So let me know what you want to see next. Let me know what you're hoping to, see in North Carolina for 2026. Who you want to win this seat. But with that being said, I will see you all the next time. Thanks for watching.